Hello, welcome to Dungeoneers Pack, a channel bringing you player-focused discussions and character guides for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. My name is Josh, thank you for watching. In 5th edition, the subclass system allows classes to flex into party roles while still maintaining their class identity. Even with this increased flexibility, the burden of responsibility of knowing a character's party role falls on the player. Knowing a character's role in the party increases player engagement, group cohesiveness, and prevents role overlap. In this video, I will be covering in and out of combat roles and where classes in 5th edition fit in those roles. With that said, let's get started. When new players think of party roles, they tend to think in terms of video games. Video games that are team focused have reinforced a generation to think of the tank, damage, and support party composition. Damage is usually split into two categories, with those being melee and range, while support is split up into a number of categories, being a combination of healer, crowd control, and a buffer or debuffer. The role identities in video games provides a good base on what party roles are, but the roles come with expectations. These ideas and expectations of party roles sometimes don't transition over to 5th edition D&D. For example, there is an expectation for many new players that there needs to be a healer that's sole purpose is just to heal the party, similar to games like World of Warcraft. This doesn't translate over to 5th edition due to a combination of how combat and healing work in the system. Healing is important to have in any party, but in 5th edition, healing is not used to keep your party's health topped off. Instead, healing is used to bring your party members back from being down to get them back into the fight. Generally, in tabletop role-playing games, party roles are not based solely on combat, but also encompass out-of-combat roles that focus on the role-playing and exploration pillars of the game. 5th edition is no different, with many classes able to flex into many in and out of combat roles due to subclass options. Before getting into the specific party roles, here is a disclaimer. The labels for roles in this video are not definitive and may not be universally used amongst the community. Many of these labels can be interchanged with other terms that are used by the community. For me, these role labels get to the point of their purpose. Let's take a look at in-combat party roles, which classes fit into each role, and how they differ from video games if it applies. The first on my in-combat roles list is what I call the Blaster. The Blaster's role is to simply attack enemies from range. There is no difference from how this role is in video games. A Blaster's focus is to get into an advantageous position from a distance and maximize their damage per round. In 5th edition, classes that fit into the Blaster role will be a range-based fighter, ranger, a range-based rogue, sorcerer, warlock, or a damage-focused wizard. Next on this list is another damage-focused role called the Striker. The Striker is a melee counterpart to the Blaster with some differences. Similar to the Blaster, the Striker is focused on maximizing their damage per round, but in melee range. The differences come down to each role's playstyle. A Blaster can sit from range and usually stay in their position. A Striker on the other hand relies on hit and run tactics due to having lower hit points, a lower armor class, or a combination of both. In comparison to video games, this would be considered your melee DPS class, but unlike video games, there are a limited number of classes in 5th edition that fit this category. It is not that melee combat isn't a factor in 5th edition, it is that many melee-based damage dealers fit into another role on this list. The few classes that would be considered a Striker would be the Monk, a melee-based Ranger, and the Rogue. The third in combat role is the Support. The support role encompasses all the crowd control, buffing, debuffing, and healing center classes in 5th edition. The reason for this is that the classes usually have a combination of abilities or spells that allow them to do a majority of these functions. This differs from video games because in video games many of these functions are usually designated into their own class, often not overlapping. You can play a healing focused character by being a life domain cleric, but even then, while your healing will be bolstered by your subclass, your spell selection allows you to cast crowd control spells on your enemies or buff your team. Even if your class doesn't heal, like the wizard, your spell list will be a combination of crowd control, buffing, and debuffing spells to classify you in this support role. The support's purpose in the group is to help the team by controlling the flow of combat. This is accomplished by healing your teammate who was just down so they can get back up and keep swinging, by casting a spell like Bless so your team can consistently land their attacks, by casting Hold Person on a key enemy so your team can turn their focus onto another threat, or by counterspelling a status-inducing spell that would take one of your allies out of the fight. The support role encompasses all the spellcasting classes in the game. The Artificer, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard can all play the support role in some capacity. The last in-combat role on this list is the Frontliner. The Frontliner is the other melee-focused damage dealer, but differentiates itself from the Striker by wanting to stay in the mix of the fight to draw enemies' attention to it. The Frontliner tends to have higher hit points, higher armor class, or a combination of both. In comparison to video games, this is the tank in 5th edition, but the reason I'm not calling the role a tank is because there's a distinct difference in how a frontliner in D&D and a tank in video games function. In video games, a tank usually has a set of abilities that purposely draws the enemy's attention to it. Also, a tank usually has abysmal damage output, with their purpose mainly being a shield for their team. In 5th edition, there are a very small number of abilities that mimic the aggro drawing abilities from video games. To be exact, there are 3 abilities in 5th edition that will be a clear transition of tanking abilities from video games. The Ancestral Guardian Barbarian's Ancestral Protector's ability, the Oath of Crown Paladin's Champion Challenge ability, and the Paladin class's Compelled Duel spell. Ultimately, the DM decides how enemies will act barring any spell or abilities. The frontliner role encompasses many classes that have a dedicated subclass that allows them to fight in melee range. The Battlesmith Artificer, Barbarian, Forge, Tempest, or War Domain Clerics, the Fighter, the Paladin, the Hexblade Warlock, and the Bladesinger Wizard are the usual frontliners. Tabletop RPGs immediately diverge from video games when it comes to out-of-combat party roles. Some video games often try to replicate this with varying success, but tend to miss the collaborative narrative nature of these out-of-combat roles. The first role on this set of out-of-combat roles is the Face. A character that is in the Face role is focused on social interaction. They are the star of the roleplay pillar of the game. In 5th edition, the classes that fit into this role all have a focus on charisma. In video games, this equates to your choices when responding to NPC dialogue, but in tabletop RPGs, you aren't interacting with a pre-written scenario. Instead, you are interacting with your DM and party members, which includes all the nuances of communication that can't be replicated in video games. The Face is directly responsible for interacting with the game world via the NPCs to overcome social challenges. The Bard, Paladin, Rogue, Sorcerer, and Warlock are all characters that can operate as the party's face because these classes are all flexible enough to have a focus on the charisma stat. The next out-of-combat role is the Muscle. A character that fills into this role is focused on solving challenges through physical action. These are the kind of characters that kick down the door, push the heavy boulder out of the way, and lift the heavy object to save the life of someone that the object is crushing. When comparing this role to something similar in video games, this is very much the same. In video games, this is usually that character that can lift the heaviest thing in the room to move it out of the way and unlock that hidden item or reveal that secret passage. The Barbarian, Fighter, Monk, and Paladin are all classes that are associated with being the party muscle. The third out-of-combat role on this list is the Scout. The Scout is simple in their purpose. They are the role that solves any survival and exploration challenges that their party may face. Being a scout, you are the star of the exploration pillar of the game. You are the expert at dungeon exploration, navigating the terrain, and avoiding dangers that may come your party's way. In most video games with characters that have a division of duties, this role doesn't exist. The nature of being a scout is granted to all characters in most video games, as by design, the developers want you to explore the worlds they created. In tabletop RPGs, especially games based on survival and resource management, a scout is needed to avoid dangers that would endanger the party's resources. In 5th edition, the classes that can be scouts are the Druid, Monk, Ranger, Rogue, a Warlock using the Pact of Chain Familiar, and a Wizard also using a Familiar. The last out-of-combat role is the Troubleshooter. The Troubleshooter role encompasses many classes that utilize a variety of game mechanics, but they all do one thing: solve non-social problems. As a non-social problem solver, the Troubleshooter uses skills, magic, or a combination of both to overcome challenges. The Troubleshooter does have some overlap with other out-of-combat roles on this list. It has the ability to answer the same challenges that other roles answer, but in its own way. The other out-of-combat roles are focused on the problem that they answer, while the Troubleshooter role is focused on finding an answer. When compared to video games, this role is governed by the player and not the character. In a video game, the player is expected to have the knowledge or use the clues to solve the problem or puzzle. In D&D, the player may know how to solve the puzzle, but the character they are playing wouldn't know based on the information their character knows. Here are some examples of what the Troubleshooter does to support their party. Knowledge-based checks to provide information to press forward with the game's plot, using thieves' tools to break down traps or get past locked doors, and casting Identify on magic items to know what they are. The classes that fit into this role are the Artificer, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Rogue, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. Now with the roles defined, there are a few things to keep in mind when making your character fit into your group. Characters are not locked into any given role in 5th edition. While some classes are better suited for a given role, it doesn't mean you can't build your character in a way to fill a gap. Taking feats, making certain skill choices, and multiclassing can allow you to take up space in another role. If you have a smaller group of players, the characters in that party will most likely fill up multiple roles. Now, if your table has a large group, my advice is to narrow down your role for that character so that each character at the table has their opportunity to shine. Again, your character is not locked into a given role, but by being aware of your role your character plays in the party, it will increase your engagement in the game, bring some group cohesiveness, and prevent some role overlap in order for you and the other players at the table to get their moment in the spotlight. With that said, I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments what party role you'd like to play in your games. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to know when new videos are up. You can catch me on the Dungeoneers Pack Discord. You can find a link to the Discord in the description below. Alright, I'm out of here. Have a good one.